Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. I'm Carlos DeBrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, March 27th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, Proprum humanae ingeni est odissi cum laesaris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, although most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them ringing Russia and China. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. today is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. An international criminal surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we do here at Aware on the Air is try to encourage our fellow citizens to oppose U.S. government killing around the world. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov once framed our geopolitical moment, world political moment at the moment, the world politics at the moment, as, quote, the West's soft landing into a new geopolitical reality. Close quote. As much as we should respect Lavrov, he's wrong on this one. There will hardly be a landing, and if there is, it's going to be hard, not soft. The declining American empire is very dangerous. Virtually all Washington factions have identified the enemy, China and Iran, of course, but mostly Russia. Not by accident, the three top vectors of Eurasia integration. The integration of Europe and Asia in an economic union that is seen by the American 1% as limiting their ability to exploit that region. The Russophobia hardcore demonization campaign in America is bound to get even worse, short of a nuclear exchange. What is to be done? Many good people say vote. But the U.S. government withdrew from its vicious war in Southeast Asia 45 years ago, not because we voted and elected anti-war representatives and senators, but because, in ascending order of importance, the American people demanded it. Second, the U.S. military demanded it. And third, the brave Vietnamese people demanded it. These conditions have to be repeated, mutatis mutandis, adaptation to the current situation, in regard to the vicious wars the U.S. is carrying out in Southwest Asia and Africa today. I have a piece here from C.J. Hopkins, the playwright, about the language being used about American war making and the propaganda that we're subjected to in understanding what's really at issue in world politics. Hopkins goes after the notion of globalism, and one has to read him carefully because what he's doing is quite sophisticated but somewhat complex. Hopkins writes, "Thank God for the corporate media. If it weren't for them and the Anti-Defamation League, I'd have probably never discovered that I'm a Nazi. Apparently, I've been one for quite some time, which is weird, as I had no idea. Here I was naively believing that I'd been writing about global capitalism and the realignment of political power and ideology in the post-Cold War world, when all along I'd really just been persecuting the Jews. I don't think I was persecuting the Jews, but such is the insidious nature of thought crime. When you're a Nazi thought criminal, as I apparently am, it doesn't matter what you think you're thinking. What matters is what the global capitalist ruling classes tell you you're thinking, which it turns out is often a lot more complicated and horrible than what you thought you were thinking. For example, I've been thinking and writing about globalism, which most dictionaries defined as a national policy of treating the whole world as a proper sphere for political influence or the development of socioeconomic networks that transcend national boundaries, or something like that, which is more or less my understanding of the term. Little did I know that these fake definitions had been infiltrated into these dictionaries by discord-sowing Strasserist agents. He does get a little recherche here. Strasserist refers to the extreme form of Nazism on economic grounds put forward by the two Nazi brothers associated with the origin of the National Socialist German Workers' Parties. He says, I've been influenced by these definitions put into these definitions of globalism, put into dictionaries by discord-sowing Strasserist agents to dupe political satirists like myself into unknowingly spreading anti-Semitism as part of Putin's master plan to destroy the United States of America and establish worldwide Nazi domination. Fortunately, lexicography experts in the corporate media and the Anti-Defamation League cleared that up for me earlier this month. According to these experts, words like globalist and globalism don't really mean anything. They're simply Nazi code words for the Jews. There's actually no such thing as globalism, or global capitalism, or transnational capitalism, or supranational quasi-governmental entities like the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank. Oh, okay, sure, there are such entities, but there is no legitimate reason to discuss them, or write about them, or even casually mention them, and anyone who does is definitely a Nazi. Now imagine my horror when I took that in, especially given my repeated references to the corporatocracy, global capitalism, and the global capitalist ruling classes in the essays I've been publishing recently. I didn't want to accept it at first, but the more authoritative sources I consulted, the more glaringly obvious my thought crimes became. These authoritative sources were reacting to Trump referring to Gary Cohn as a globalist in his rambling remarks in the Oval Office, which went a little something like this. Cohn just resigned as the chief economic advisor to the presidency. Quote, this is Trump, "He may be a globalist, but I still like him. He is seriously a globalist. There's no question, in his own way. But you know what? He's also a nationalist. He loves our country, and where is Gary?" Close quote. While the experts are still scouring the video for Nazi gestures and facial expressions, there can be no doubt that Trump said the word globalists. The corporate media and the ADL could not allow that transgression to stand. Peter Beinart, writing in The Atlantic, explained that globalist is, quote, an epithet, a modern-day vessel for a slur against Jews. And he linked to a video of Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the ADL, who verified that, quote, the term globalist was developed and originated in extremist circles populated by white supremacists, close quote, by which I can only assume he meant the anti-globalization movement, which apparently is just a big Nazi front. Eli Rosenberg in the Washington Post, although allowing that globalist can sometimes mean globalist, emphasized that to some observers of extremism, it also, quote, speaks to something darker, close quote. Bret Stephens in the New York Times couldn't quite decide whether using the word makes you an official goose-stepping Nazi or just a garden-variety anti-Semite. CNN's Don Lemon, delving into the ugly history of the word, explained that, quote, it is shorthand for a worldview based on racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. The worldview of far-right conspiracy theorists obsessed with prominent Jews like George Soros, close quote. And these are just a few of many examples. After processing all these authoritative statements by these respected experts and credible news sources, I felt like I'd been walking around with a swastika branded on my forehead. I was overcome by a sudden need to signal my anti-Semitism to my friends, family, and the world at large. After destroying my old Pink Floyd CDs and apologizing to Jerry Seinfeld on Twitter, I immediately ran and confessed to my wife, who just happens to be a globalist, and begged her to call her family members who control the media, the banks, and Hollywood, and asked them to forgive me my thought crimes. Then I drafted an email to the Southern Poverty Law Center asking whether they could possibly squeeze me into their interactive hate map somewhere, or at least let some neo-McCarthyite hack publish a ridiculous paranoid smear piece about my Nazi vocabulary on their website. Seriously, though, all satire aside, the stigmatization of terms like globalist, globalism, and global capitalism is a key component of the war on dissent which the global capitalist ruling classes have been waging against a broad assortment of insurgent elements for the last 18 months. It isn't just a question of delegitimizing dissidents by smearing them as anti-Semites, Russian agents, and conspiracy theorists. The goal is also to conceal the essential nature of the conflict itself. The essential nature of the conflict is neoliberalism versus neo-nationalism. This is what we're experiencing currently, not a Russian assault on Western democracy, nor even a resumption of the Cold War, but rather the global capitalist ruling classes putting down a neo-nationalist insurgency, the insurgency that led to the Brexit referendum and the presidency of Donald Trump. Some people would call it populism. Now here's where things get a little tricky, particularly for those of us on the left, whatever that label even means anymore. The neo-nationalists can come right out and call the conflict what it is. It is in their interest to call it what it is. They may not be opposing capitalism, but they are certainly opposing global capitalism. In doing so, they are attracting people who are not so thrilled about being governed by unaccountable global corporations and supranational non-governmental bodies. People are still emotionally attached to outdated concepts like national sovereignty, national culture, and crazy stuff like that. Some of these folks are actual neo-Nazis, but most of them are just regular people who know when they're being disrespected by global capitalism and told it's raining. The point is, the neo-nationalists can describe their opponents as exactly what they are, global capitalists or just plain old globalists. Neoliberals do not have this luxury. See, the problem for the capitalist ruling classes is that global neoliberalism, globalism, untrammeled capitalism, is a really tough sell to regular folks. They can't just come out and explain to people that national sovereignty is essentially dead. Countries can't make laws against global capitalism. And that political power now resides among a network of global corporations which couldn't care less about their nationality, exploiting a globalized labor market, which is why their good jobs are not coming back, and a globalized financial market, which is why almost everything is being privatized and their families are being debt enslaved. Nor can they admit that the war on terror and the European refugee crisis it has caused, and the chaos and slaughter in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Syria, etc., is the predictable result of global capitalism aggressively restructuring the greater Middle East, which it started doing more or less immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That is, as soon as the final impediment to its pursuit of global hegemony was removed. This kind of thing doesn't go over very well, not with most regular working class people. So what the global capitalist ruling classes have to do is, well, they have to lie. They have to disseminate a different narrative, a narrative that has nothing to do with the hegemony of global capitalism, the dissolution of national sovereignty, and the privatization of virtually everything. Because people aren't total morons, this narrative needs to bear some resemblance to the actual conflict taking place. So, all right, a little rebranding is in order. Global neoliberalism becomes Western democracy. Neo-nationalism becomes Nazism. And Vladimir Putin becomes Adolf Hitler. Presto, now things are nice and simple. History, geopolitics, and socioeconomics vanish into the ether. Capitalism, schmapitalism. This is no time for critical thinking, not with Putin Nazis coming out of the woodwork. No, this is a time to rally behind the freedom fighters at the FBI, the CIA, the corporate media, and the rest of the military-industrial complex, and to mercilessly hunt down Russian infiltrators, Putin sympathizers, crypto-Assadists, neo-Strausserian alt-right entryists, and other sowers of division and discord. We need to get these folks delegitimized, stigmatized as racist and anti-Semites, or terrorists, or some other type of extremist, before they can influence anyone else with their Facebook ads and subversive essays, and I might say subversive TV programs. You'll know them by the words they use and by the words they do not use. Anybody using words like globalist, global capitalism, or neoliberal, or suggesting that anyone voted for Trump or Brexit for any reason other than racism, you can pretty much rest assured that they're Nazis. Also, anyone writing about banks or the deep state, absolutely Nazis. Oh yeah, and the corporate media, naturally. Only Putin Nazis talk like that. Oh, and definitely anyone who hasn't spent the last 2 years attacking Trump, as if there has been anything else to focus on, or has implied that the Russians aren't out to destroy us, or that the historical moment we're living through might be just a bit more complex than that. Well, you know what they're really saying. They're saying, we need to exterminate the Jews. Look, I could go on and on with this, but I don't think I really need to. Remember, I'm a Nazi thought criminal now, so just go back and read through some of my essays, or listen to some of our programs, and make note of all the coded Nazi messages, or check with the Anti-Defamation League, or the Southern Poverty Law Center, or the corporate media, or, well, just ask the good folks at Google, who seem to be down with the program. This is a piece from C.J. Hopkins, and an important piece, I think, difficult perhaps to follow, because what he's talking about is the corruption of language and discussion in politics in recent months particularly. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we are trying to discuss the falsifications that make for war and lead the U.S. to be the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, as M.L. King said. In a concluding part of the program, in the next part of the program, we have a note from our Director of Research, Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, on Russiagate. Russiagate, as you know, is the attempt to demonstrate that President Trump was elected because of the meddling by Russia and that he's Putin's puppet, controlled or at least strongly influenced by the government of Russia. Nonsense, you say? Of course it's nonsense, but this is exactly what's being said by the liberal wing of the American political establishment, and has been since Trump's election and before. This week, Guccifer 2.0 was outed. Guccifer 2.0 is a internet presence the source of comments and information that's turned up on the internet. And it was said this week that security researchers, you remember them, probing Russian meddling in the 2016 election, have determined that the online persona Guccifer 2.0, which leaked hacked political material to journalists and on a public website, was run by the GRU, Russia's military intelligence agency. According to the Daily Beast, which is a web page, Guccifer revealed his identity accidentally when he logged on after forgetting to turn on his VPN, his virtual private network. That was the report this week. We asked our director of research, a computer expert, who's not named Guccifer, but is rather named Dr. No, to evaluate this report. He says it could be true, but does it matter if it's true? Not really. It's the substance of what was in those emails that were leaked. These were emails from the director of Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democratic National Committee. It was the substance of what was in those emails that really mattered. And this is yet another attempt that's distracting us from understanding how the poor are disenfranchised enough to vote for Trump, who said some true and remarkable things which hadn't been said in a major American presidential campaign in decades. I think that's exactly right. What Trump did was to attack the neoliberal and neoconservative principles that have guided all recent administrations up to and including the Obama administration. He said a lot of other things, too, a lot of contradictory things in that campaign, Trump did. But those attacks did indeed register with a good bit of the electorate who cast their ballots for him. The Daily Beast article has many problems. The Daily Beast makes claims with no evidence about Guccifer 2.0. If what they claim about his VPN use is real, they should be able to give us specific evidence, IPs, VPNs used, times, dates of the events leading the Daily Beast to the conclusion they posted. No such evidence is posted at the Daily Beast. All we're told is, quote, Elite VPN, a virtual private networking service that had an exit point in France but was headquartered in Russia, which isn't nearly enough information. Do we know Guccifer 2.0 is one person? If so, how do we know this? Again, details matter if you want the public to buy the story. Perhaps one person, a set of people, did forget to turn on their VPN and revealed something of whatever network connection they were using before that VPN. Maybe multiple people are using a single alias, Guccifer 2.0. If multiple people are involved, identifying only one of them is hardly a win that the Daily Beast and Mr. Mueller needs us to believe that it is. The Daily Beast notes Mueller's indictment, quote, stopped short of directly implicating the Putin regime, close quote, which it did, although you wouldn't know that from mainstream media. But being under the direct control of Putin was a key point in Russiagate supporters' line, including Hillary Clinton's rhetoric. What happened to that? Why should we let them off the hook for that? Where's the evidence to support that claim? VPNs, virtual private networks, can be chained together to further obfuscate one's location on the network. Typical VPN use is data from one's computer. Typical VPN use is data from one's computer can go to a VPN, another computer, which relays the data to the internet server one wants to communicate with, an email server, a web server, a chat server, etc. Or one can set up multiple VPNs to work together. Data from one's computer can go to VPN 1, then to another VPN, and then to the internet server one wants to communicate with. Servers can only look back one hop, so service logs would reflect a connection from VPN 2, not VPN 1, or the IP assigned to the user's computer. Quote, Guccifer 2.0 sprang into existence on June 15, 2016, hours after a report by a computer security firm forensically tied Russia to an intrusion at the Democratic National Committee. That conflicts with another report that said some DNC emails were leaked, released from within, not hacked, that is, obtained remotely over the internet, because the DNC's network connection was not fast enough to convey the volume of data released in the leaked emails, i.e. it couldn't have been a result of an intrusion from outside. It had to be someone with control of the DNC's computer that managed to leak that large amount of information. Does the name Seth Rich ring a bell? Regarding working off the IP address, U.S. investigators identified Guccifer 2.0 as a particular GRU officer working out of the agency's headquarters on Grizodubovoy Street in Moscow. Yeah, that's what they said. An IP address reveals less than is commonly described. Part of the laughter behind our running joke years ago about the fact that people in the Seychelles Islands were downloading our radio version of the program News from Neptune comes from how little we know about who actually downloaded those episodes. We don't care who downloads them. They're available for all to share, but VPNs makes the data very unclear. There are VPNs with connections to networks listed as being in the Seychelles. The Seychelles are a group of islands off East Africa, and there were people there who were monitoring our Champaign-Urbana radio program, and we had various guesses about who they were. It could be that someone in the U.S. used a VPN to download episodes by first connecting to a VPN with IPs listed as being in the Seychelles, then downloading the show files. That would make the Seychelles IPs appear in newsfromneptune.com logs, rendering them virtually useless. Similarly, we don't know how the Daily Beast concluded Russian IP addresses meant a Russian citizen is involved, or that the person was, quote, an officer of Russia's largest foreign intelligence agency, close quote, as was alleged in Daily Beast. Salient details are not listed. Interesting details include which IPs were involved, which IPs were issued to which VPN users. Do we know who the users really are? When were the IPs issued? If the VPN shares IPs, meaning many VPN users can be issued the same IP address. If the VPN service doesn't keep logs, it makes tracking users even more difficult. Some organizations, the CIA and the NSA, have connections to networks all over the internet. Therefore, they can make their internet connections appear to come from anywhere. WikiLeaks has also told us of programs the CIA uses to disguise their operations, to mislead efforts like this, and get investigators to pin the blame on someone else. Hence, we need hard evidence to evaluate on our own so we can verify the Daily Beast's conclusions. Do what I say, not what I do, says the CIA and NSA, double standards. Presaging the leaks that would roil the election, Guccifer 2.0 declared that he'd already sent the bulk of the stolen material to WikiLeaks, which has spent the time since obfuscating whether Guccifer was its source. That's what the Daily Beast article says. That suggests criticism that WikiLeaks isn't telling us who released the data to them, but we're supposed to accept that the Daily Beast sources did not disclose which particular GRU officer working out of the agency's headquarters on Grizodubovoy Street in Moscow worked as Guccifer. There are meta-issues concerning this article. Is Mueller's investigation going to use the Daily Beast as a place to release information and not use another indictment? Is Mueller probing the election collusion by Russia and Trump? Is Mueller using the Daily Beast as a test balloon to see if we buy the story before they raise the same story elsewhere? Why indict those other 13 people and not the person, the Daily Beast assumes as throughout the article it is one person, identified as Guccifer 2.0? Russiagate supporters have a horrible track record to date. They have a lot to answer for, even if everything in this article is 100% accurate and true. Why aren't the servers holding all of the compromised materials in the FBI hands? Why was any delay allowed? As I understand it, Clinton's private email server is still in the hands of a private organization, the DNC, which alleges to be a security firm but behaves more like a PR firm. There's much more on this story. We will try to keep this up, but it seems to me that it is even more reason to conclude that the White House should indeed end the Mueller inquiry and end the desperate search for evidence that Russia influenced the defeat of Hillary Rodham Clinton. Should end the Russiagate investment in the attempt by the Democrat and the Democrat Party and the War Party to reverse the 2016 election and reestablish the wars in Afghanistan, Syria, North Africa, and war provocations versus Russia and China from Ukraine to the South China Sea that characterized the last administration. That's what the Mueller investigation is all about. The great fear is that Trump will actually act on his promise to talk to Putin, to make up with Russia, join the joint investigation of the peculiar Skripal affair in Salisbury affair in Britain, that he'll actually talk to the North Koreans and the Chinese, as he's promised to, and prevent the 1% from continuing to use war and rumors of war as ways to boost America's declining economic hegemony in Europe and Asia. That's the wish of many people around the world, from China to Germany and elsewhere. And it's clearly what the U.S. should be doing. You have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 13th week of 2018, another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is worldwide war-making by the United States. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson of Research. See No's notes on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, along with articles referred to tonight, and some other things, including Nicholson Baker's fascinating essay, Why I'm a Pacifist, The Myth of the Good War. We'll conclude tonight with a piece from the Real News Network on the new National Security Director, National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who was recently appointed to the post held in the past by Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski of unhappy memory. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, Ethan Young, and Andrew Scholarly. Thanks to him, also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. We'll remind you of the Aware meeting this Sunday from 5 to 6 p.m. at the Hammerhead Coffee Shop on the corner of University Avenue and Wright Street in Campus Town. This Thursday evening, a lecture on campus, perhaps the most important I've heard of on this campus for a while. Tariq Ali, a writer from Britain, who is well known as a commentator on political affairs, will be giving a talk entitled The Broken Ladder, The Global Left 50 Years After 1968. This important talk will be given on the Thursday evening, the 29th, at 7:30 p.m. in 210 Levis Faculty Center. And I think there'll be a crowd, so you may want to get there early. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, Ed Mandel, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. In yet another cabinet shuffle in Washington, President Donald Trump fired H.R. McMaster and replaced him with John Bolton as his security advisor. Bolton was originally considered for a cabinet post, but Trump passed over him in the first round. But that didn't stop Bolton from auditioning for a post in the White House, since he appeared on Fox News regularly, and apparently President Trump was all ears. The appointment came in a tweet just a week after Trump fired Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State and nominated Central Intelligence Agency Director Mike Pompeo for the post and replaced Pompeo with Gina Haspel. John Bolton has served various presidents over a 30-year span. Here is some of his historic statements.
There is no United Nations. The United States makes the UN work when it wants it to work. And that is exactly the way it should be, because the only question for the United States is what's in our national interest.
I think the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, that military action, was a resounding success. President Bush's surge policy, when his administration ended, stability had returned to Iraq. You have to look either at one more diplomatic play to convince China to reunite the peninsula with us in a constructive way and eliminate North Korea, or you have to look at the military option. There's an all-purpose joke here. Question: how do you know that the North Korean regime is lying? Answer: their lips are moving. They're not going to give up achieving this objective. Why would they agree? Why would they propose talks now? Because they want to buy time, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is they need to get across the finish line. Now,
with Pompeo as Secretary of State, John Bolton as National Security Advisor, and Gina Haspel as the CIA Director, many in Washington and around the world are speculating that Trump is formulating a war cabinet to raise the stakes against Iran and North Korea. Joining us now to discuss John Bolton and his history and what he wants us to dismiss in his history is Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis is director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. Phyllis, good to have you with us.
Good to be with you, Sharmini.
Phyllis, the New York Times, in this morning's editorial, they had a headline saying, "Yes, John Bolton is that dangerous." Phyllis, you have had a specific encounter with John Bolton. Let's start with that.
Well, I first met John Bolton 25 years ago. We were on opposite sides of a public debate on the question of the nature of the United Nations and the role of the United Nations in what was then still the new post-Cold War era. This was 1994. And it was rather extraordinary. It was 1,000 people in the audience, or close to 1,000, all of whom were people who cared very deeply about the United Nations. And John Bolton got up and said the famous lines that are now being quoted in articles all over the world about how there is no such thing as the United Nations. When the United States leads, the United Nations will follow. When it suits our interests to do so, we will do so. When we don't think it suits our interests, we will not. And then he goes on to disparage the UN further and talks about the 38-story UN headquarters in New York and says you could cut off the top 10 floors and no one would notice the difference because it doesn't do anything. It was a stunning moment. And at the time, I didn't realize how, I was stunned by it, of course, but I didn't realize how horrifying it really was until I thought about it later. And then as I watched over the years, watched the role that John Bolton played, at that time, he wasn't even in government. He was outside of government. This was during the Clinton administration. But it was a pretty stunning moment. Very soon, when war with Iraq was on the minds of the neoconservative cabal that he was part of, Bolton was very central in the work of popularizing and cheerleading for that war and for helping to make it happen. He didn't just cheerlead. I think that's one of the important things, Sharmini, is that his role has not been that of somebody who just was a pundit who wrote editorials supporting the war in Iraq, for instance. He was actually helping to have it happen. one of the ways in 2002, for instance, he was a sort of mid-range, mid-level official in the State Department of the second Bush administration, George W. Bush. This is when the run-up to the war in Iraq is just beginning. And there was concern in Washington that their claim that had no basis, as we now know, was based fully on lies. The claim that the claim that the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein had so-called weapons of mass destruction, specifically chemical weapons, maybe biological weapons, something else. That was a big part of the justification for mobilizing support for war. There was a fear that if there were actual weapons inspectors sent into Iraq to find out, they would find out that in fact there were no viable weapons of mass destruction, that it was all based on lies. And one of the things that was the responsibility of John Bolton was to orchestrate the ouster of José Bustani, who was a Brazilian diplomat who was at the time the chief of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And in that context, he would have been responsible. He was already negotiating with Saddam Hussein about sending in a whole team of weapons inspectors. This is when Iraq was talking about wanting to join the Chemical Weapons Treaty. To do that, he would have had to submit the whole country to massively intrusive inspections. That was not in Washington's interest because it would have proved that there were in fact no weapons of mass destruction. So the work went on led by John Bolton to get him out, to instead have somebody who would respond to the US need to keep the inspectors out of Iraq. And Bolton went directly, this came out publicly some years later, the New York Times and others wrote about it. Bolton went to the office of Bustani and said, you've got 24 hours to resign or else. And if you don't, there will be consequences. And Bustani refused. This is only 11 months after he had just been voted in for a second term by a unanimous vote of the 145 members of the treaty. And when he refused to step down, Bolton orchestrated a move to vote him out. It had never happened before. He was voted out and replaced by someone who was far more willing to abide by Washington's dictates. So he played a very key role in setting the stage very directly for the Iraq War. And that was even before he was the ambassador to the United Nations, the other roles that he's played. So for years, he has been pushing for war rather than diplomacy. He wanted war against Iraq. He wants and wanted war against Iran. He wanted and wants war against North Korea. There has never been an arms treaty or a negotiating process that he didn't want to get rid of and replace it with a direct military assault in the interests of Israel in some cases, in the interests of the right-wing views in the United States in other circumstances, but he has always supported war and opposed diplomacy.
All right, Phyllis, given what you're saying about his disbelief in the United Nations, that it is an effective body of any sort to govern the world, and then yet he served as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Do you expect him to advise Trump to bypass the United Nations in the issues that we're dealing with now, North Korea, Iran nuclear agreement that's in place, that's secure, that others have signed on to?
Absolutely. I think there's no question that he will have absolute dismissiveness towards the United Nations. And more dangerously even than that, he will and has made clear that he has no interest in international law. He does not appear to believe that international law is binding on the United States. In his article just 3 weeks ago, for instance, on calling for a first strike against North Korea, he used the argument that the international law restrictions on first strike simply don't apply because he says they don't apply. He says they don't apply any longer in this era because it might be a possibility that sometime in the future, North Korea might be capable of attacking the United States. He agrees it's probably not now, but says it might happen sometime, and therefore we have the right to attack them. It's this sense of America first on steroids. You know, this notion that there is no accountability that the United States is bound to. Every other country in the world is bound to abide by international law, except for the United States. And the United States has the right to use military force of its own volition against any country that might not be abiding by international law. So it's an extraordinary version of this kind of exceptionalism that is so incredibly dangerous. You now have an administration where the president has surrounded himself with all of the most extreme elements, the most Islamophobic, the most opposed to diplomacy, the most favoring war. Of all of the people that he has had at various points, he's been replacing his own administration right and left. And what people like to call the adults in the room, most of them are gone. They didn't do much to keep the others in line anyway. His favorite advisors, who were all generals, other than General Mattis, who's still the Secretary of Defense, all the others are gone, with the exception, again, of the current Chief of Staff, who Trump is now indicating he may fire him and not even replace him, not even have a Chief of Staff. Just run the place the way he always ran his businesses, by his gut, by his instinct. And he's surrounding himself now with people, as you mentioned, like John Bolton, like Mike Pompeo, who has been at the CIA, who is a supporter of torture, who does not believe, for example, that waterboarding is torture, and replaced him with his deputy, who they call Bloody Haspel, at the CIA. And she's somebody who not only supports torture, but is known to have overseen a black site torture center in Thailand, is known to have signed off on the order to destroy the evidence of that torture. She's just been nominated to be the new head of the CIA. So he's surrounding himself with people who agree with his view that diplomacy has no interest for the United States and that war should replace diplomacy. It's a very, very dangerous moment. The New York Times editorial board is absolutely right in saying, yes, he is that dangerous.
All right, Phyllis, finally, with this scenario and the convergence of the people appointed to advise him that we have just mentioned, Haspel, Pompeo, now Bolton, our saving grace might actually be Trump, given that he had advocated and said that he was against the Iraq War, and also when it comes to North Korea, he was very quick to jump on a possible meeting. Just on Sunday, after President Putin won the election in Russia, he was quick to get on the phone and congratulate him and suggest that there should be a meeting. So what do you think of this, I guess, configuration now in Washington, with Trump being the advocate for peace?
Very dangerous to assume that anything he said yesterday has any bearing on what he does today. I think that's what we've seen with this president. There is no consistency to his policy. The fact that he agreed to a meeting with the South Korean leader on one day doesn't mean that, number one, he will go ahead with that meeting. Number two, if he has people around him like John Bolton advising him, and he will be the national security advisor, which does not require approval by the Senate or by the Congress, he will be told, I have no doubt, that he should go into that meeting and simply say to Kim Jong-un, the leader in North Korea, that I'm here to find out what your plan is for surrender and full disarmament. And as soon as I hear that, we'll have something to talk about. Until I hear that, we will have nothing to talk about, and this will be a very short meeting. I could well imagine that kind of advice on what his meeting should look like. I think the notion that Trump himself is somehow not reflective of the kind of warmongering, anti-diplomacy approach of these advisors that he has chosen himself would be a mistake. And that if we're looking for the saving grace, as you put it, that relies on us, on people who will challenge these positions, who will push Congress not to certify, not to accept these people, those that do need Senate oversight that do have to be approved by the Senate, that the Senate not vote for them. We should keep in mind that John Bolton was voted down by the Senate when he was nominated to be the ambassador to the United Nations. He only got that position temporarily in a so-called recess appointment because Bush was so eager to have him there that he was willing to challenge the decision, including the majority decision of members who were Republicans, who voted against approving him as the ambassador, and he went ahead, appointed him as on a recess basis where he could only serve for, I think it was 10 months, and then he could not be approved for a full term. If he is in this position, again, he doesn't have to get Senate approval. He will be in that position, and it's going to be up to mobilization of people that are saying that it's not acceptable for someone who accepts torture to be the head of the CIA, for someone who is an Islamophobic warmonger to be the national security advisor, for the Secretary of State to be someone who disdains diplomacy and prefers war, that these are not acceptable appointments. It's going to have to be a massive movement to change that. It's not going to come from Trump himself.
All right, Phyllis, I'll let you go for now, but I'm sure we'll be talking about this in the very near future again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.